Welcome to the Pave the Way podcast, a Raahgiri Foundation podcast. And this is a special series that we're doing for the CAQM Resource Lab. I'm Sherry Frosh, and we're going to take a deep dive into vehicle emissions today. Um, Now, if you're into vehicle emissions at all, and I'm assuming you are because you're listening to this podcast, you've almost certainly heard of this famous Dieselgate scandal. It's an emission scandal that shook the global auto industry in 2015. You may have heard of it, but you probably don't know the research organization that uncovered the scandal. And so, my guest today is Rachel Muncrief. She's the interim CEO of that very organization, the International Council on Clean Transportation, or the ICCT. The ICCT is a global research body whose work sits at the foundation of many of the world's vehicle emissions and clean transport policies. Rachel brings 24 years of expertise in transportation and climate, and she has been closely engaged with India's own clean transport journey. Today, we are going to speak about what the evidence actually shows, both globally and here in India, regarding transportation's role in climate change and air quality, and what the policy conversation looks like right now. Rachel, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really
Okay.
appreciate it. I'm
We're
looking forward to
just-
the discussion.
We're just going to dive right into it. I love the phrase, the science that informs the policy. And that's, so whenever we hear about ICCT, that's kind of the phrase that I remember. And for our listeners who may not be so familiar with the ICCT, would you tell us a bit about the organization, what you do, and highlight some of the latest research that you're particularly excited to talk about today?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So the ICCT, we are a global nonprofit organization. Our mission is very simple. We want to eliminate all of the climate and health impacts from the global transportation sector. And of course, that's a major challenge, and transportation plays a major role in climate and health impacts. And we strongly believe in government and the power of government and the power of what government policy can do um, to really accelerate those really clean technologies so that we can still have a great and thriving transportation system. But on the other hand, it can be clean and not contribute to harming our planet and harming health. So what we do is a lot of actually technical work, like you were saying, in science to inform really strong, good policymaking. We believe rigorous technical data is sort of the backbone to strong policymaking. And at the same time, we also know that many government agencies that are working to regulate the transportation sector don't necessarily always have all of the resources to do all of these really deep, rigorous studies. And I think, third party, independent, technical organizations like the ICCT can really fill in a lot of those gaps and really support governments in having the best information so that they can make the best policies. One thing that I'm really excited about, and it's actually work that's been happening right here in India and in Delhi, is some studies that we've been doing under one of the initiatives that we're a partner in called the TRUE Initiative. It stands for the Real Urban Emissions Initiative. And as part of that study, we've actually been going out into the city of Delhi and a couple other cities in India, and we've been taking snapshots of real world emissions from vehicles that are actually driving on the roads. And we are able to calculate those emissions and see how they compare to maybe the laboratory emissions. And one thing that we always tend to find is that the real world emissions, for one reason or another, are typically higher, and sometimes a great deal higher than you might think. And once we have that information, we can then give it to the cities and that's a really good reason why they need to really accelerate on working on getting some of these dirty, polluting vehicles off the road faster.
Yeah, and speaking of real world, I mean that's kind of where this original story
Yeah.
kind of came from, right? What started off as just a small study, it wasn't even to look for wrongdoing or anything like that. It just uncovered this huge corporate scandal. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I
Yeah.
think that's really
Yeah.
interesting, huh?
To talk about that one, I kind of need to take you all the way back to maybe about 2012, 2013. At the time, The United States Environmental Protection Agency was the strongest environmental protection agency in the world. We had the strongest emission standards for vehicles. And one particular very tricky emission um, pollutant is called NOx emissions, it's nitrogen oxide emissions. It's very, very harmful to human health. And the EPA had the most stringent regulations in the world for NOx emissions. And one thing about NOx emissions is that for petrol vehicles or gasoline vehicles, it's a little bit easier to control, to reduce those emissions. For diesel vehicles, because of the composition of the exhaust, it's harder. And due to the fact that uh, we had such strong emission standards in the United States, we actually didn't have that many diesel vehicles because it was very difficult for the manufacturers to meet those emission standards. But we did have a few. We had some Volkswagens, and now you go across the ocean to Europe. All of a sudden in Europe, there's many diesel vehicles on the road. They also had emission standards on paper. But we were noticing that it seems like the air quality wasn't getting better. It seemed like there was still high emissions, and we couldn't figure out why. Like, how is it that um, there's vehicles in the United States and under more stringent emissions, and then the vehicles in Europe seem to be much higher emitting. So the theory was in the US, they must be doing something to actually clean up these, like ensure that the manufacturers are cleaning up their diesel vehicles. So we commissioned some testing. To show that diesels could actually be clean because they had to be clean in the United States because the EPA had such strong emissions regulations. We commissioned the testing. We ran the car in a lab. It was very, very clean. And then we also ran it on the road. And that was when the emissions were 24 times the emission limits. And we actually at first thought there must have been something wrong with the testing equipment. That was our first thought. So there's no way. But the more and more we looked, we were like, this is actually accurate. What is going on? So at that point, gave the information to the authorities. We said, look, we should look into this. We're not quite sure what's happening here, but there's something going on. And they looked into it and they found that there was cheating. They found that the emissions control system was being turned off when it went into the real world and turned on when it knew it was being tested.
It's just crazy. I mean, it's a huge company like Volkswagen,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I hope they paid the damages that they needed to for
Yeah.
public health, the
Yeah.
damage that they
They
caused.
had they had significant fines, and that was also something that was really good because you can have very stringent emission standards, but if you don't have strong compliance and an ability to actually penalize, those who sort of cheat or don't comply, then the emission standards don't have a lot of teeth.
Yeah, and I think this is a great segue into like the study we did in Delhi. And again, what you said, 24 times. It's not 24%
Yeah.
more. It's 24 times. I mean, you can't even call that a gap. It's just such a huge thing. And we found that with cars in Delhi, all kinds of, especially cars that have high mileage, like taxis and some of the three-wheelers. And it was crazy when I saw some of the numbers, 30x, 20x, and so tell us a bit about the India study and what's going on there.
Yeah, yeah. And I just also want to say up front, many times we find that real world emissions are higher than those in the lab. That doesn't always mean that there's cheating happening, right? So there's many different reasons why vehicles might be having high emissions. Like you mentioned, as vehicles get older, sometimes the emissions go up. Sometimes vehicles are not maintained well. There could be a number of, or sometimes there's emissions that are actually not part of the regulation, and they might, yeah. So there's many reasons. One of the things to keep in mind is I think whenever you are sort of combusting something, burning something, you're always going to have this risk of high uncontrolled emissions. And that's honestly one of the reasons that we, really see electric vehicles as a good part of the future solution to this. There is no tailpipe. you don't have to worry about emissions in the cities driving around being higher than you thought because there are no emissions from the tailpipe. And so, when we do these studies in Delhi, we're able to look at, vehicle emissions by segment. So you might look at different types of, trucks and buses and cars and 2 and 3 wheelers. And then we're also able to look at them by age, so older or younger. And then, we're able to draw a lot of conclusions and say, okay, if Delhi, look, if you want to focus on cleaning up emissions, focus on these pieces of the fleet first, because these are the ones that are putting out the highest emissions. So, like you said, older vehicles or 2 and 3 wheelers are a big emitter. Some of the natural gas vehicles were very much higher than we thought
That
they
was
would
a
be.
surprise.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So that kind of information actually helps cities know where to focus first, because it's sometimes hard to just do everything at once.
Yeah, all right. And now let's zoom out a bit and look at the kind of the biggest picture. Um, the ICCT publishes an annual Vision 2050 report and assesses, where the world stands on zero emission vehicles. So, based on the latest edition, I know that's what you guys are talking about a
Yeah.
lot. Where do we stand in the
Yeah.
world?
Yeah. So we are trying to see, of course, we have the Paris Agreement. That's kind of like the North Star, and that is a little bit like, how do we keep global warming under ideally under to meeting a 1.5-degree temperature rise this century, but ideally at least under 2 degrees. So we look at, what's the transportation sector's piece of that. And in order for the transportation sector to sort of align with the Paris Agreement, we need to see significant, dramatic reductions in the next 25 years. And so every year we look at sort of what trajectory are the policies around the world driving vehicles to clean up, and how well is that aligned with Paris? We know that pretty much the only technology that can be in the fleet that's actually aligned with the Paris Agreement in terms of carbon emissions are electric vehicles. There's no other technology, at least for the on-road fleet, that actually can get the level of CO2 reductions needed to decrease the transportation sector emissions enough. So there's some positive things and some negative things from the Vision 2050 report. I would say the positive thing is that, we're finally bending the curve. Let's say, global transportation emissions have been increasing every year, year on year, and always looks like they were increasing into the future. This is one of the first times now it looks like it's kind of at least stabilizing and maybe even projecting to go down a bit in the future. So that's good news.
That is.
Um, the not so good news is we're nowhere near the amount of projected reductions that we're going to need to align with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So we need a lot more action. By governments around the world to put in place stronger policies to bend that curve even further. One of the other, I think, really interesting things that came out of that report, and that we've been tracking really closely at ICCT, is how the global EV market is shaping up. We're seeing the biggest growth right now in electric vehicles, not in Europe, not in the US, but in emerging markets in Southeast Asia. Yeah, like countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, and actually even in Latin America, we're seeing really significant increases in even places like you might not expect, Brazil and Chile. So it's really interesting to see how that global market is evolving, and I don't think it's evolving in the exact way that maybe people expected some years ago.
Right. And talking about that, I mean, you also published a part of this was on India,
Yeah.
and you looked at and one of the pieces of data that really stood out for us was that meeting the current national and state EV targets that we already set, we could halve our emissions in India, and that's probably the biggest kind of opportunity globally for cutting carbon emissions, and that's so exciting for us. Also, another thing that we were really excited about was that, I mean, it didn't strike us until we saw the data point that 80% of our EV sales are domestic production, which we just took it for granted. This, of course, we make our own, but it's a highly unusual, right? So tell us a bit about how the India story fits into the EV story.
Yeah. And I also do think, because we've already talked about health emissions, and we talked about climate, but I think also the EV transition is really about economics. If the economics aren't there, it's going to be a lot harder to make this transition happen. So I think it's really, really important that countries realize that this is a whole new world. This is a whole new technology. There are economic opportunities on the table now for jobs and for growing, new sectors and becoming a much bigger player, even in a global supply chain. So I think it's really, really important that that piece is really leveraged, I think, by governments. Strong industrial policy. There should be incentives for the manufacturing to take place here in the country where the vehicles are going to be sold, and seeing that as a really growth opportunity, and not just even for the vehicles that are going to be sold in India. I mean, there's a global market out there, and this is a prime time. I mean, you're seeing just like a really big shift in the global manufacturers, and things are shifting out. So I think anything that India can do to promote accelerated electrification within the country that will promote domestic manufacturing, and that will also position, I think, India to get more into the export market and be a leader, and not like um, a laggard in
And it's a huge
manufacturing.
market that, I mean,
Yeah.
even if we just can cater to our own and not rely on imports, I mean, that's so
Exactly.
great
Exactly.
for us. And you kind of touched on this a bit, that it's policy momentum that is driving a lot of this transition. Not, you can't just rely on market forces. And uh, and the prediction is that ICCT prediction is that the EV adoption curve will steepen after 2030. So, we're at 12% right now in Delhi, but we're expecting, I mean, of course, with policies, but that's what it's the policies that will drive it, right? We can't just expect that, oh, the whole market will just switch over because it's a better technology. And so, tell me a bit about how that, the play between the market-driven policies and the
Yeah.
policy-driven.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think the one thing that we always bring up when we think about electrification is you have cost parity, because it's actually the battery costs have been coming down. It's cheaper to sort of run an electric vehicle. Typically, electricity is cheaper than fuel. And so right now it will be right now or in the very near future more viable economically for consumers to buy an electric vehicle. And on top of
So
that,
we've reached parity, yeah?
we've let's just say in some places we actually the upfront cost even of a new electric vehicle is cheaper than the comparable internal combustion engine. For all vehicles, if you add up like the cost of actually purchasing the vehicle and then running it for some years, you get the cost parity. But consumers obviously are really concerned with the upfront cost a lot too. So currently that's happening in some sectors in some regions. Within the next, I would say 4 or 5 years, I expect that to really flip. And so like upfront cost parity, even without incentives, is going to be there. So because of the cost factor and the fact that overall it's better technology, people like driving it better, it's quieter, it's cleaner, less maintenance, cheaper to run, all of those aspects, I do think like electric vehicles will be accelerating anyway. However, like we just talked about the need to really accelerate quickly to meet climate goals. So I think what the government role here is to put in place policies to accelerate that even further and even faster than would happen naturally with regular market forces, because it might, we need to kind of pull this forward. We don't have the time to wait for just the market.
Yeah, I mean, we know we're going to get to 100% EVs, but we just need that curve to be, faster, so that I believe there's a 47% gap right now between what the world is emitting in terms of transportation emissions versus what where we need to be for Paris. So that's it's a big thing,
Yeah.
and any push we can get, and really not sacrificing anything, right? So I think it's great. Um, we I wanted to do a deep dive into the Delhi EV policy draft because that's something we're really excited about in India, because Delhi kind of usually sets the stage for the rest of India, and this draft has been particularly aggressive in pushing supply mandates rather than the usual, incentives to buy EVs. Um, so could you tell us where you stand on that and how you feel?
Yeah. I was actually really excited. I got here and I started hearing all about this proposal from Delhi, and I think it's an amazing first step. So for those of you who are not following it, this one so far is like they're focused on proposing that in the next number of years they're gonna start to eliminate registration, like allowing registration for new ICE 2 and 3 wheelers. So I think that's an amazing start. I mean, that's
Mm.
really like a progressive policy. And it's great to start with the 2 and 3 wheelers because I think those are there's a lot of them on the road. They're very high polluting, and also there is a lot of great availability of electric models for that segment. And so then, of course, that's one piece of the pie, and definitely great to work on that. And then I think moving on to other segments that are very high polluting, the trucks, the buses, the cars. I think that hopefully will come later as well. And like you said, Delhi is a leader, so hopefully once Delhi is able to kind of put these policies in place, it'll expand out and it'll go to other cities. And I really think it's great to see this sort of city level, very progressive leadership.
Yeah. And when one of the reasons that, I mean, it's leadership, and it's also the need of the hour, right? So Delhi has been one of the most polluted capitals in the world for
Yeah.
several years now, and air pollution is uh, this lived reality that we're daily thinking about whether we should wear masks, whether the children should go to school, and it's become a very it's just a very visceral kind of a thing for most people living in India. But you talked a little bit about NOx, and I just wanted to touch on that. So we talk. Our conversation is often around PM 2.5, and we don't really talk. We don't really in the air pollution space and in general public, we don't really get into NOx and SOx and ozone and the secondary particles, and also the role of black carbon. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the chemistry. I know that's something that you're really interested
Yeah.
in, and how does NOx? Why should we keep NOx in mind? We usually meet our NOx targets in India, but the fact that it goes up into the atmosphere and forms secondary particles, and I think people don't really quite
Yeah.
understand some of these things. So, would love
Yeah.
for you to just go all out on the chemistry of this.
Yes.
Mhm.
Let's we'll get a little wonky for a second here. So right, there's two. So of course the term PM 2.5. So the 2.5, it references the size of the particle. So 2.5 micrometers, and so it's really like tiny. And the reason it's so bad is because very tiny particles can go the deepest into your lungs and get into your body and cause the most harm in many different ways. And so in general, when we think about vehicle emissions, there's two types of PM 2.5. There's primary 2.5 and secondary 2.5. So the primary 2.5 is kind of a part of what you mentioned. It's that direct small particles that come right out of the tailpipe right when uh, the fuel is burned. So it's part of the makeup of the black carbon. Is there's particles in there that are very small
Mhm.
and very bad to breathe in. So that's kind of the primary um, PM 2.5. And then the secondary PM 2.5 that you mentioned, that is PM 2.5 um, that's created from the emissions when it's already in the atmosphere. So they call it, you've heard of like photochemical smog. So basically what happens is you get all of this chemical mix. You have like NOx emissions, you have VOCs, you have sunlight, and in these conditions, you actually create chemical reactions that takes these emissions gases and makes it into solid particles. And you and those are also and so then they're also very small. They can also be breathed in, and they're also very very bad for human health. One of the byproducts of that reaction is ozone. So a lot of times, ozone is kind of used as a marker to measure the amount of sort of photochemical smog or secondary particulate matter in the atmosphere. And so it can be a marker for sort of like how unhealthy the air is that day. So basically, what we need to do is reduce. That's why we need to focus on reducing both the um, primary PM 2.5, which is essentially coming from the black carbon emissions, as well as the secondary 2.5, which comes from the VOCs and the NOx
Right.
emissions.
And we often hear of black carbon as being a bit of a super pollutant. I
Yeah,
mean, how is that? And especially
yeah,
from diesel, right?
yeah,
And old diesel. So, could you kind
yeah.
of elaborate on that a bit too?
Yeah. So the term super pollutant, and this goes back. We're kind of going back and forth between talking about health and talking about climate. And black carbon is actually where there's a lot of overlap on health and climate. So black carbon not only has that PM 2.5 component that's very, very unhealthy to breathe in. It also is, it can lead to global warming. So it basically traps heat, and it can essentially it leads to global warming through a slightly different mechanism than carbon dioxide, but it's still very, very bad for climate change. And also, one thing that's quote unquote good about black carbon is that we really know how to reduce it. I mean, all you need to do is put a particle filter on the tailpipe of the vehicle. It's not hard, it's not that costly, it's really well known. And if we can do that, or get the diesel vehicles that don't have particulate filters off the road faster, we can actually really do something in the short term, to address climate change, even while we're still working to reduce CO2, big picture, long term.
Right, and even with the latest, the
Yeah,
BS6 diesel,
yeah,
you do worry that some of the people will take off the particulate filter, right? So that's where I think this real world emissions or some kind of testing would really help. And then and getting into the diesel, the uh, the big polluters there. It's always surprising to me that whenever we think about vehicular pollution, we think about, well, there's too many private vehicles on the road, we should have better public transportation. But one statistic that stands out to me is that 2% of vehicles, which are the heavy duty vehicles, the trucks and the buses, account for 40% of road transport emissions. So, and that's just not part of our daily conversation, perhaps, when it comes to lay people. So, could you talk about this freight blind spot, as we call it?
yeah. Yeah, that is correct. And so the good news there is that, also those trucks can be electrified. And I think, for not that long ago, we were kind of like, well, how are we going to really decarbonize freight, and how are we going to decarbonize those really, really long haul trucks? Can we put batteries on them? And I'm really happy to say, like, over the last few years, I think it's become clearer and clearer that the answer is yes. There's already long haul electric trucks running, even in India today. There's some pilots going. There's, of course, some going in China and Europe, and I see that technology will be coming along really quickly. And I also think the good news there is that, this might not be fully intuitive, but because those trucks run many more miles, and because they're owned by commercial enterprises who make sort of decisions based on the bottom line, um, r- uh, if these trucks can actually pay back faster and can set the businesses that use them up, to actually have more profitability. So it's a great thing when, technology and health and climate and profitability, like, all come together under, a single technology. So again, it comes down to policy, and it comes down to how quickly can we accelerate, getting these technologies onto the road and working on addressing with government, with civil society, with the industry, whatever the different barriers are to getting that technology adopted faster.
And that's really exciting.
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, the decisions would be total cost of ownership
Yeah.
for most truck drivers, right? So it should help that the market will kind of drive that a lot faster. Um, and spoke about China a bit. I'd like to uh, talk about kind of comparing India and where its places with the rest of the world. So I know in Europe there's a couple of superstars that are like 95% electric, or Norway and Denmark, and then there's China, which is because it's so huge, and it's 50% electric in the last 10 years, I guess. Um, so that's what are the kind of learnings that we can get from some of these countries, and what are the cautionary tales too that we
Yeah.
should be paying attention to?
Yeah. And I do actually just came from Beijing before I came to Delhi, so it felt like the future there. They have electric vehicles everywhere, and this was not an accident. This was something that the government saw. I think they definitely saw it from a climate and health perspective, but they also saw it from like an economic opportunity. And so, if you rewind about 15 years ago, I think that was when the Chinese government decided, they really wanted to get into the global automotive market, and they saw going and being a leader in the new era of like batteries and electric vehicles as their a really big opportunity for them. And so it was a really whole of government strategy and a whole of government approach that they took. So it wasn't just one government agency that started putting in place standards. It was sort of like, from the city level and the regional level and the highest and the national level, they had fiscal incentives, they had policies, they have, infrastructure planning, they have all sorts of things. And because it was a whole of government approach, and because it was everyone was sort of on the same page, like this is where we're going, that's why they've been able to build up so quickly. And of course, once you get, like you mentioned, it's a huge market. Once you get to certain numbers, you get these economies of scale that really drive the costs down much faster. Um, so that's been great. And in terms of cautionary tales, um, I think I'm coming from the US. I live in the US. I think, one of the challenges there is because we don't have a whole of government approach. In the United States, the concept of electric vehicles has become very politicized. And the reason for that is because we have a very, very powerful fossil fuel industry that does not, that wants to slow this transition down. And they're very strong from a political standpoint. So that's basically why we don't have a whole of government approach. We don't have like a general agreement from everyone, like this is the direction we're going. And so this is constant like political battle, which is really a shame. And honestly, if I had the solution to that, I would
No,
tell
I
you,
mean,
but
I
I
would love to
don't. But
know.
yeah,
Because that's something we
yeah,
see, working in
yeah,
cities, is that we can do all this lobbying,
yeah,
we can do all this policy work, but then it's all so dependent on who's
yeah,
the next administration. How do you
yeah,
make it durable? How do you?
yeah,
So I mean,
yeah,
what kind of have you seen any lessons around the world that can help with the durability, the stickiness of some of these
yeah,
policies?
yeah. And I mean, we in the U.S. we have had a very, I would say, durable system for a long time. We have a very extreme situation happening right now. There's a lot of litigation that's going to happen over the next couple of years. So, I'm very hopeful that we can kind of get um, things back on track and moving the right direction. I will say, for example, when you look at, Europe, that is a little bit of a different situation. They have, while they do have some really strong regulations, they've been slightly weakened. They do again have a general understanding, like this is the direction we're going. There's maybe going to be some negotiations here and there, but overall, this is the direction we're going. I think the one thing I also want to mention, which kind of goes back to what we are talking about before in terms of economics and industrial policy is if you can tie electric vehicles to economic benefits, jobs, those kind of things, it's going to be a lot harder to undo them, right? Because now you have a lot more constituents that want that technology and want to kind of and have a reason to keep it going.
Right. And in our case, I think in India, it's not just that we're producing most of our domestic electric vehicles in India, but also that we don't have that strong fossil fuel industry. We are reliant on imports, right, for fossil fuels. So it just hits both ways economically for us, that if we can cut down on the fossil fuel bill and also, be a player in the global EV car sales, that's such a huge opportunity for us, and I hope we are able to kind of jump on that. All right, one more thing I really wanted to talk about is also, the reduction in, we often talk about fossil fuels being, well, you have to extract them, then you have to ship them, then you have to refine them, and then they're burning in the car on the street, right? But EVs also have a cost, and so there's a lot of pushback of it that, well, in India especially, we have about half of our electricity still comes, more than half, still comes from burning coal. So why do electric vehicles have an edge? Why wouldn't we want to go with a hybrid strategy? So could you talk a bit about why electric vehicles?
Yes. So you're talking about the life cycle of the tire vehicle. So far, we've talked mostly about the tailpipe, but completely agree. It's really about the actual life cycle of the vehicle. So it's about, the manufacturing of the vehicle. There's emissions related to steel. There's emissions related to producing either the engine or the battery. And then, of course, like you said, there's the emissions related to the electricity for electric vehicles, for the fuel production. So all of those things. ICCT, as well as a number of other technical groups, have done life cycle assessments. And at this point, within the scientific community, there's very strong consensus that there's really no question anymore. And I know that it still kind of comes up as a talking point. We have addressed this kind of year after year after year. It is sort of I think somehow a continued talking point of the opposition. But we're happy to always share, because I know it's not something that people have always thought of and paid attention to. But even in India, which I agree has one of the more carbon intensive grids, even in India today, electric vehicles on a life cycle basis are 38% less CO2 emissions life cycle than comparable internal combustion engines, and also less than hybrids. And that's only going to get better and better moving forward, because India's grid is cleaning up and will continue to clean up. And one of the points I always try to make is you can't wait until the grid is fully clean to then start deploying electric vehicles. These two things have to happen in parallel. And I always say, imagine in 10 years, you buy a vehicle now, and in 10 years, the vehicle's actually cleaner than it was when you first bought it, because the grid is cleaner. So I think that's the typical points that we're trying to make.
And conversely, any ICE vehicle you buy today will still be, putting
and if
out,
anything, dirtier, because they're
right,
the emissions. Exactly.
That's great. And just touching on, also the batteries. One thing I think over the last few years we discovered, or I discovered, was that these batteries are going to be recyclable. At some point, we may be able to stop mining, and that's we're also very dependent on importing the lithium or whatnot, which I think China has done a good job in securing those supplies. So can you talk a bit about batteries and the life and how that has played out?
I can talk a bit about batteries. Okay. We do have some battery experts at ICCT. I do need to actually get my expertise on batteries a little bit more. But the thing that it's so amazing about the battery technology is how quickly the technology has been improving in terms of energy density, in terms of durability, in terms of the amount of materials needed to essentially make the vehicle go the same range and the same distance, and then the amount of times that battery can be charged and discharged and that sort of thing. So that has improved so much, and it's not stopping. I mean, all the projections are like, this is going to continue to improve. You'll probably be seeing ideally some new battery chemistries coming, different mixes, different creative things that are going to be coming out in terms of battery technology. But I do agree with you, lithium is an important uh, material for making batteries and will be for the foreseeable future. And we do need to think about supply chain diversification. I know India is thinking about it, countries in Europe are thinking about it, Latin America. There is, believe it or not, a lot of lithium out there. So it's not like it takes a while to sort of ramp up those resources and all of that kind of thing. So it's, again, one of these things that I think has to happen in parallel. For now, yes, China, of course, has a head start on the lithium value chain, but I do think that there's going to be opportunities, and it's currently being worked on ways to diversify that supply chain. I think that's healthy. And so, we work on that. Maybe there's opportunities for international collaboration with India, with other countries as well, to work on that piece. And meanwhile, there's many other pieces of the sort of battery and EV supply chain that India can start ramping up expertise on while they're working on the supply chain diversification piece there.
Great, great. And also, could we talk a little bit about the recyclability of the batteries?
Yeah, and that is, I think, also very, very important, because we don't want to just, we want to limit mining as much as we can. There is still probably a significant amount of more battery materials that will need to be extracted, but you can project that might level off in some time. We've actually done some studies on that, available on our website, a little plug, on the projection of how would it look if we really maximized recycling. How would it look in terms of material needs moving forward? And I think even though we project like a lot of growth in the electric vehicle market, if we maximize recycling, we can really see that we can level off the needs for sort of like new extraction in the future.
That's such good news. I mean, to me, there's a lot of good news in this podcast, and I was really and when you're talking about electric vehicles being 38% better in total life cycle emissions, I mean, what people forget is that they're 100% better in terms of the emissions you're breathing on the street. For a child walking to school on the street, like, would you rather have a bunch of cars, putting out the emission, burning fossil fuels and putting out emissions, or having these electric vehicles? And I think that is often lost, is that the huge kind of for cities, for pedestrians, for cyclists, people out on the street all day, what a huge benefit that is for them. So the EV story is really good news for all of us, and thank you so much for helping clarify a lot of those doubts and talk about the policy on that. It was really great having you. Any final thoughts that you'd like to close this with? Something that you feel that we haven't covered in this?
No, I mean, I really appreciate you having me, and I think the questions were so relevant, and I agree. I mean, to me, the health aspect, we talked about climate, we talked about economics. The health aspect is so tangible, and it's also something, me personally, that it's been like a through line for my entire career. That I started working 2002 on trying to figure out how to get catalysts to reduce diesel exhaust. So I think, I would love to really see that in my lifetime, that, we're really not having this severe impact from vehicle emissions to people around the world. And I think that's really important.
Great.
So, great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.